The silence in the room was not empty. It was heavy, textured like velvet. Outside, the London rain battered the skylight, a rhythmic drumming that sounded like polite applause from a distant audience. The puppeteer did not rush. Art cannot be rushed. He adjusted the angle of the victim's left arm, tilting it just so. It had to drape over the velvet armchair with the languid grace of a sleeping queen, not the rigor of a corpse. The woman, Evelyn, had been beautiful in life, but she was breathtaking now. Quiet, obedient, eternal. "Chin up, darling," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle in the expansive library. "The light hits your cheekbones better this way." He stepped back, narrowing his eyes behind the mask. The scene was set. The fireplace was cold, but he had arranged the charred logs to suggest a fire that had simply given up, much like Evelyn. He walked over to the vintage gramophone in the corner. He didn't play a record. The silence was part of the composition. Instead, he placed a single red rose inside the brass horn, a secret for the observant. He looked at his hands, gloved, immaculate, no blood. He wasn't a butcher, he was a director. He checked his pocket watch, an antique piece that ticked loudly in the stillness. It was time for the curtain call, or rather, time to open the doors for the critics. The police would come with their flashlights and clumsy boots, trampling over the nuances, seeing only death where he had created a tableau. But maybe he would come, the one they called Atlas, the one who saw the strings. The puppeteer smiled beneath his mask. He placed a small porcelain doll on the mantelpiece, facing the dead woman. The doll's eyes were painted wide open, staring in mock horror. "Break a leg, Evelyn," he murmured. He vanished into the shadows, leaving the masterpiece to be discovered. Detective Inspector Sarah Thorne hated opulent houses. They always smelled of old money and secrets, and tonight, this Kensington mansion smelled of copper and expensive perfume. "Status?" Thorne barked, ducking under the yellow police tape. She was a woman of sharp angles and sharper patience, wearing a trench coat that had seen too many crime scenes. Sergeant Miller, a young officer who still looked green around the gills, approached her with a notepad. "Victim is Evelyn Sterling, aged 32, wife of a tech mogul. Looks like a robbery gone wrong, ma'am. The safe is open, jewelry is missing. She probably surprised the intruder." Thorne looked at the body. Evelyn Sterling was seated in a high-backed armchair facing the cold fireplace. She looked peaceful, too peaceful for a robbery. "Robbery implies chaos, Miller," Thorne grunted. "This looks like a bloody painting." "That's because it is one, Detective, though I'd argue the composition is slightly derivative of the Victorian Gothic era." Thorne didn't need to turn around to know who spoke. She suppressed a groan and closed her eyes for a brief second before turning. Atlas Vance stood in the doorway. He was wearing a three-piece suit that cost more than Thorne's car, but his tie was loosened, and his hair was just messy enough to suggest he had just rolled out of bed, or a very interesting party. He wasn't looking at the body. He was examining a bookshelf, holding a cup of tea he had undoubtedly stolen from the kitchen. "Atlas," Thorne said, her voice a warning, "you're late, and you're not supposed to touch anything." "I'm not touching evidence, Sarah. I'm appreciating the literature. Did you know the husband buys books by the yard to match the wallpaper? None of these spines have ever been cracked. Tragic, really. Worse than the murder." Atlas finally turned his gaze toward the corpse. He didn't flinch. He didn't look grim. He tilted his head to the side like a bird inspecting a shiny object. "So," Atlas said, taking a sip of tea, "Miller thinks it's a robbery?" "Safe is empty," Miller defended himself, puffing out his chest. "Entry point was the back window." Atlas walked into the room, stepping carefully. He didn't walk like a cop. He glided. He stopped 5 feet away from the body. "A robbery," Atlas mused. He pointed a slender finger at the victim's feet. "Look at her shoes, Miller. What do you see?" Miller squinted. "High heels, expensive ones, red bottoms." "She's wearing 6-inch stilettos," Atlas corrected. "And yet, look at the Persian rug beneath her. It's pristine. If she had surprised a burglar, she would have run or stumbled or kicked. There would be drag marks, scuffs, a disturbance in the pile of the rug. But she's sitting there as if she's waiting for a photographer. Atlas moved closer, leaning in but keeping his hands behind his back. And the lighting. Sarah, look at the floor lamp. It's not aimed at the book she was supposedly reading. It's aimed at her face, specifically to highlight her jawline. Maybe the killer moved the lamp during the struggle, Thorne suggested, though she knew he was onto something. There was no struggle, Atlas said softly. The playfulness vanished from his voice, replaced by a cold, surgical focus. Miller, the jewelry isn't missing because it was stolen. It's missing because it didn't fit the costume. This woman wasn't killed for money. She was killed for an audience. Atlas crouched down by the fireplace. He picked up something with a pair of tweezers he produced from his vest pocket. "What is that?" Thorne asked, stepping closer. "A porcelain doll," Atlas whispered, holding it up to the light. "And look where it's looking. It's not looking at us. It's watching her die." Atlas stood up, his eyes scanning the room, seeing things no one else could. The microscopic dust patterns, the alignment of the shadows, the terrifying symmetry of death. "This isn't a crime scene, Sarah," Atlas declared, a dark smile playing on his lips. "It's a stage, and I'm afraid the show has just begun." Atlas knelt beside the velvet armchair, his movements fluid, almost reverent. The police photographer, a burly man named Evans, hesitated, looking at D.I. Thorne for permission. Thorne just pinched the bridge of her nose and waved a hand, signaling him to wait. "You said this is a love letter," Thorne said, stepping into Atlas's personal space. The smell of her stale coffee battled with his Earl Grey. "Explain, before I throw you out for contamination." Atlas didn't look up. He was staring at Evelyn Sterling's hands. They were resting on her lap, fingers interlaced loosely. "Look at her nails, Sarah," Atlas said softly. Thorne squinted. "Manicured, red, matches the lipstick, so what?" "Not just manicured, freshly painted," Atlas corrected. He hovered his hand over the victims, sensing the residual chemicals. "The lacquer is perfectly smooth, no chips, no smudges. But look at the cuticles. There is a tiny smear of red on the skin of her left ring finger. A professional wouldn't make that mistake. And Evelyn, she was a perfectionist, wasn't she? Her books are color-coded, her shoes are aligned by heel height. She wouldn't have left the salon with a smudge." "So the killer painted her nails?" Miller asked, his face paling. "After she was dead?" "Precisely." Atlas stood up, turning to face the room, his eyes alight with that manic intelligence Thorne found both useful and infuriating. "Imagine the scene, Miller. He didn't just kill her, he washed her, he dressed her, he applied her makeup. He sat here, probably for hours, waiting for the polish to dry, fixing her hair." Atlas walked over to the gramophone where the red rose sat in the horn. He didn't touch it, but he leaned in, inhaling deeply. "Violence is fast, Sarah. Anger is messy. A crime of passion involves shattered glass, torn clothes, multiple stab wounds. But this?" He gestured to the corpse with a theatrical sweep of his arm. "This is intimacy. He treated her like a doll that needed to be fixed. He didn't want to destroy her, he wanted to preserve her. To him, she wasn't a victim. She was a masterpiece that wasn't quite finished until he stopped her heart." "A twisted love letter," Thorne murmured, finally seeing it. "He's saying he loves her more than anyone else could, enough to make her eternal. Or," Atlas added, a shadow crossing his face, "he's saying she belongs to him, completely. An object doesn't get to choose its owner." Atlas turned back to the body for one final inspection. He moved behind the armchair. The police team was distracted. Thorne was barking orders at Miller to check the local salons, and the photographer was changing his lens. This was his moment. Atlas leaned down to the nape of Evelyn's neck. The killer had swept her hair up in an elegant chignon, exposing the pale skin of her neck. To the naked eye, it was flawless. But Atlas wasn't looking with the naked eye. He was looking with the obsession of a former con man who knew every trick of misdirection. There, just below the hairline, hidden by the shadow of the collar, it was a tiny puncture mark. almost invisible. But it wasn't the mark that made Atlas's heart skip a beat. It was what was stuck to the skin right next to it. A microscopic residue, a glittery silver dust. Not makeup. It was too coarse to be eyeshadow. Atlas extended his hand, his long fingers moving with the speed of a magician. In one swift motion, he brushed the nape of her neck. He felt something slightly sticky. Between his thumb and forefinger, he captured a tiny, almost invisible fragment of a substance. He brought it closer to his face, shielding it from Evans's camera flash. It was a flake of silver leaf, the kind used in high-end culinary plating or theatrical mask-making. But there was something else. Caught in the clasp of her diamond necklace, so thin it was like a spider web, was a clear synthetic fiber. Fishing line? No. Marionette string. The realization hit Atlas like a physical blow. The killer hadn't just posed her, he had rigged her. He had used strings to hold her arms in that perfect, languid position until rigor mortis set in, and then he had cut them. This wasn't just a tableau, it was a literal puppet show. Atlas knew that if he told Thorne now, the forensics team would swarm. They would bag the fiber, likely lose it or contaminate it, and the press would get wind of the puppet master angle by morning. The killer would know the police were onto his specific methodology. He would change his game. To catch a player this arrogant, Atlas needed an ace up his sleeve. An ace nobody else knew existed. He slipped the tiny fiber and the silver flake into a small plastic bag he kept in his vest pocket, a habit from his days of sleight of hand, and palmed it instantly. "Find anything else, Atlas?" Thorne asked, turning around suddenly. Atlas straightened up, his face a mask of bored indifference. He shoved his hands into his pockets, hiding the evidence. "Just dandruff," Atlas lied smoothly. "Shame. Ruins the aesthetic." He stepped away from the body, walking towards the window where the rain was still weeping against the glass. "The husband," Atlas said, changing the subject. "Where is he?" "At the station," Thorne replied. "Claimed he was at a charity gala. We're verifying his alibi." "Don't bother," Atlas said, watching his own reflection in the dark window. "He didn't do it. He's too boring. A man who buys books by the yard lacks the imagination for this." "We follow procedure, Atlas, not hunches." "It's not a hunch, Sarah. It's a profile. The man who did this," Atlas turned back to look at the beautiful dead woman one last time, "is someone who thinks he's God. And he's going to be very disappointed when he realizes I'm the one auditing his universe." Atlas walked past Thorne, heading for the door. "I'll meet you in the interrogation room. I want to talk to the husband. I want to see if he grieves for his wife or for his possession." "Atlas," Thorne called out, "I didn't clear you for interrogation." Atlas waved a hand dismissively without looking back. "Better hurry, Sarah. I'm already inside his head." As he walked down the grand hallway, Atlas fingered the small plastic bag in his pocket. Silver leaf and a puppet string. The killer had left a signature, assuming no one would look close enough to see the mechanics of the trick. Atlas smiled. The game had officially begun. The drive to Scotland Yard was a blur of neon lights and rain-streaked windows. Atlas sat in the back of Thorne's unmarked car, humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like a funeral march. He wasn't looking at the case files. He was eyes closed, reconstructing the crime scene in his mind, placing the invisible strings, feeling the texture of the silver leaf. When they arrived, the atmosphere shifted from the gothic silence of the mansion to the sterile, fluorescent hum of the station. "He's been in there for 2 hours, Thorne said, pointing through the one-way mirror of Interrogation Room 4. "Richard Sterling, tech mogul, arrogant, lawyered up. He hasn't said a word other than, 'I want my solicitor.'" Inside the room, Richard Sterling sat like a coiled spring. He was handsome in a corporate way, sharp suit, expensive watch, and a leg that wouldn't stop bouncing under the table. "He's terrified," Atlas observed, leaning his forehead against the glass. "Of course he is," Miller scoffed, standing behind them with a coffee cup. "He killed his wife." "No," Atlas murmured. his breath fogging the glass. A man who spends hours posing a corpse with the delicacy of a sculptor doesn't bounce his leg at 120 beats per minute. The killer has the patience of a spider. This man? He has the patience of a toddler. Atlas turned to Thorne. "Give me the room. Alone. Turn off the recording." "I can't turn off the recording, Atlas. That's illegal." "Then accidentally unplug it. Give me 2 minutes. If I don't get a confession or the truth, I'll buy you lunch for a month." Thorne hesitated, looking at the man behind the glass, then at Atlas. She sighed, a sound of deep resignation. 2 minutes. If his lawyer walks in, I don't know you. Atlas slipped into the room. He didn't slam the door. He didn't sit in the chair opposite the suspect. Instead, he walked to the corner of the room and stood there, staring at the blank wall, his back to Richard. The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 20. "Who the hell are you?" Richard finally snapped. "Are you a cop?" Atlas turned slowly. He didn't speak. He walked toward the table, his eyes locked on Richard's pupils. He bypassed the chair and sat on the edge of the table, encroaching on Richard's personal space, looking down at him. "You didn't love her," Atlas said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, delivered with a soft, hypnotic cadence. "Excuse me? My wife is dead," Richard shouted, half rising. "Sit down, Richard," Atlas commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a peculiar resonance that made Richard sink back into his chair involuntarily. "I didn't say you killed her. I said you didn't love her. There's a difference." Atlas leaned in closer. "Close your eyes." "What?" "Close them. Now." Atlas's voice dropped to a whisper. "You're back at the gala. The champagne is warm. The music is boring. You check your phone. It's 9 p.m. Evelyn is at home, dying. But you're not thinking about Evelyn. Your heart rate is spiking right now, Richard. I can see the vein in your neck pulsing." Richard's eyes fluttered shut, his breathing shallow. Atlas had hijacked his amygdala. "You're afraid," Atlas continued, his voice smooth like silk. "Not because you killed her, but because you were doing something that would ruin you if the police found out. Something worse than murder in your social circle. Shame." Atlas placed a hand on the table, tapping a rhythm, tap, 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 matching Richard's heartbeat, then slowing it down. "The police think you drove home and strangled her, but you didn't have the car, did you?" Richard's eyes snapped open. "How did you—" "Shh. The valet ticket in your pocket implies you stayed until the end, but your shoes— there's mud on the instep, not city grime. Garden mud. You snuck out the back." Atlas's eyes bore into him. "Who were you with, Richard? Who is worth risking a murder charge to protect?" Richard looked at the mirror, then back at Atlas. He crumbled. The arrogance evaporated, leaving a pathetic, small man. "It wasn't a who," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "It was a poker game, illegal high stakes, in the basement of the hotel. I lost 50,000 pounds. If investors find out I'm gambling again, the company stock will tank. I was there from 8 to 11. There are cameras, but they are hidden. I can get the footage." Atlas smiled, a sad, knowing smile. He stood up and brushed invisible dust off his suit. "Gambling," Atlas said loudly, for the benefit of the mirror. "Pathetic, but not homicidal." Atlas walked to the door. Hand on the handle, he turned back. "One last thing, Richard. Did Evelyn like dolls?" Richard blinked, confused by the shift. "Dolls? No. She hated them. She had a phobia, pediophobia. She couldn't even look at a mannequin." Atlas felt a chill run down his spine. The killer knew. The porcelain doll on the mantelpiece wasn't just a prop. It was torture. The last thing Evelyn saw before she died was the one thing she feared most. Atlas exited the room. Exactly 2 minutes. Thorne was waiting in the hallway, arms crossed. "Well, he's innocent," Atlas said, walking past her. "Check the basement security of the Ritz-Carlton. He was losing his fortune at poker while his wife was being turned into an art project. Great, Thorne groaned, falling into step beside him. So we're back to square one. No suspect, no motive. Oh, we have a motive, Sarah, Atlas corrected, his expression darkening. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of hate disguised as love. The killer knew her phobias. He knew her intimate schedule. So it's someone close to the family? Yes, Atlas nodded. Someone very close. Someone who could walk into that house without breaking a lock. Someone invisible. They reached the bullpen, the main office floor. It was chaotic. Phones ringing, officers shouting. We need to look at the staff, Thorne said. Or friends. Or, Atlas paused. He was looking at a man standing near the entrance of the station. The man was tall, wearing a long charcoal wool coat that looked damp from the rain. He was holding a plastic bag containing a personal item, likely brought for the investigation. He had an air of refined sadness, a quiet dignity that drew sympathy from the female officer he was talking to. Who is that? Atlas asked, nodding toward the stranger. Thorne looked. That's Dr. Arthur Pendelton, the family psychiatrist. He came in to drop off Evelyn's medical files. Apparently, he heard the news and wanted to help. Atlas narrowed his eyes. The man, Dr. Pendelton, turned his head slightly. For a brief second, his eyes met Atlas's across the crowded room. He didn't look away. He didn't blink. He offered a small, polite nod. Atlas felt the plastic bag in his pocket, the silver leaf, the puppet string, burn against his side. Introduce me, Atlas said, a predator's focus locking onto a new target. I have a feeling the good doctor has some fascinating insights on grief. The distance between the interrogation room and the reception desk was only 20 meters, but to Atlas it felt like crossing a minefield. He watched Dr. Arthur Pendelton with the intensity of a hawk circling a field mouse. But Pendelton didn't look like a mouse. He looked like a statue carved from ice and old manners. Dr. Pendelton, Thorne said, approaching him, thank you for coming in. This is... She gestured vaguely at Atlas. Our consultant, Mr. Vance. Pendelton turned. Up close, he was even more immaculate. High cheekbones, graying hair swept back with precision, and eyes that were a shade of blue so pale they looked almost transparent. Mr. Vance, Pendelton said. His voice was a rich baritone, soothing and cultivated. I've heard of you, the man who reads minds, or at least pretends to. He extended a hand. He wore no gloves now. Atlas took the hand. It was cold, dry. The grip was firm but controlled. I don't read minds, Doctor, Atlas replied, holding the handshake a second longer than socially acceptable. He wasn't just shaking hands. He was reading the map of the man's palm. I read behavior. Minds are messy. Behavior is predictable. Is it? Pendelton smiled, but the smile didn't reach those glacial eyes. I find human behavior to be a chaotic storm. That's why psychiatry exists, to bring order to the chaos. Or to rewrite the script, Atlas countered. Tell me, Doctor, Evelyn Sterling, was she a chaotic storm? Pendelton withdrew his hand and clasped them behind his back, a posture of superiority. Evelyn was fragile. She sought perfection because she feared the messiness of real life. She wanted everything in its place, her books, her shoes, her emotions. And her death, Atlas pressed. Was that in its place? Thorne interjected, sensing the tension. Doctor, Mr. Vance has a unique way of asking questions. We appreciate the files. Did Evelyn mention anyone threatening or unusual? Pendelton turned his gaze to Thorne, dismissing Atlas for a moment. She felt watched, Detective. She told me last week that she felt like a character in someone else's play. I assumed it was a manifestation of her anxiety. Paranoia is common in her condition. I prescribed sedatives. I see now that I may have been too clinical. A character in a play, Atlas repeated softly. He stepped closer, invading Pendelton's personal space again. The doctor didn't flinch. He smelled of sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and something else. Something faint and chemical beneath the layers of luxury. "You speak of her with great affection, Doctor," Atlas observed, "but you're not sad." "I am a professional, Mr. Vance. I process grief internally." "Do you?" Atlas tilted his head. "Your heart rate is steady. Your pupils aren't dilated. You're not grieving, Arthur. You're excited." Thorne's eyes widened. "Atlas, enough." Pendelton chuckled softly. It was a dry, rattling sound. "You mistake intellectual stimulation for excitement, Mr. Vance. A tragedy has occurred. As a student of the human condition, I am naturally compelled by the theatricality of it. I hear the scene was quite specific." He knew. The police hadn't released details about the theatricality yet. "We didn't say it was theatrical," Atlas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Oh, come now." Pendelton smoothed the lapel of his coat. "Rich husband, beautiful wife, empty safe. It's a classic tragedy, isn't it? Medea, Othello. The tropes are eternal." Pendelton checked his watch, a vintage piece, similar to the one the killer might use. "I'm afraid I must go. I have patients who are still alive. Detective Thorne, call me if you need to decode her psyche further." He turned to leave, but stopped and looked at Atlas one last time. "Be careful, Mr. Vance. When you look too long into the abyss starts to find you amusing." With a nod, Dr. Arthur Pendelton walked out into the rainy London night. His movements were rhythmic, precise. He didn't just walk, he glided. "He knows something," Thorne said, watching him go. "But he's a psychiatrist. Doctor-patient privilege covers a lot of sins." "He doesn't just know something, Sarah," Atlas said, staring at his own hand, the hand that had touched Pendleton's. "He wrote the play." "You think he did it? Based on what? He was creepy?" "No." Atlas turned to her, his face pale. "Based on his hands." "What about them?" Atlas rubbed his thumb against his index finger, recalling the texture he had felt during the handshake. "He has a callus," Atlas explained, his mind racing. "On the side of his right index finger and pinky. It's a very specific friction burn. You don't get that from writing prescriptions. You don't get that from golf." "So where do you get it?" "From a crossbar," Atlas whispered. "The control bar of a marionette. When you manipulate a heavy puppet for hours, the strings bite into those exact spots. He's a puppeteer, Sarah. A master one." Thorne stared at him. "A psychiatrist who plays with dolls." "And there was a smell," Atlas added, bringing his hand to his nose. "Beneath the sandalwood cologne. It was faint, but I caught it when he smoothed his lapel. Turpentine and linseed oil. Art supplies. Wood treatment for maintaining vintage wooden figures." Atlas looked at the door where Pendleton had vanished. "He didn't come here to help. He came here to inspect the investigators. He wanted to see if we were worthy of his game." "If you're right," Thorne said, her hand drifting to her radio, "we bring him in." "No!" Atlas grabbed her wrist. "You can't. We have no evidence. A callus? A smell? A metaphor about plays? Any lawyer would destroy us in 5 seconds and he'd sue the department into oblivion. He's taunting us, Sarah. He wants us to arrest him prematurely so he can humiliate us and walk away free forever." "So what do we do?" Thorne demanded, frustration boiling over. Atlas smiled, but this time it was a cold, predatory smile. "We don't arrest him. We applaud him. He wants an audience? Fine. I'll be his audience. But I'm going to heckle him until he makes a mistake." Atlas reached into his pocket and pulled out the small bag with the silver leaf and the string. "He thinks he's the director," Atlas murmured. "But he just cast the wrong lead actor." "Where are you going?" Thorne asked as Atlas turned toward the exit. "To the library," Atlas called back. "I need to learn everything about the history of marionettes." And I need to find out where a man like Arthur Pendelton keeps his toys." As Atlas walked out into the rain, he didn't feel the cold. He felt the exhilaration of the hunt. The puppeteer had made his first move, but Atlas Vance never played by the rules. The city archives was a tomb for forgotten sins, smelling of dust and decaying paper. It was 3 a.m. Thorne had pulled strings to get Atlas in, though she still thought he was chasing ghosts. Atlas sat at a long wooden table, surrounded by stacks of cold case files from the last 2 decades. He wasn't reading them linearly, he was scanning patterns. He was looking for the drafts before the masterpiece. Pendelton was too good, too refined. Evelyn Sterling couldn't be his first kill. You don't paint the Mona Lisa without sketching a few hands first. "Come on, Arthur," Atlas whispered, flipping a page. "Show me your sketches." And then he found her. A file from 15 years ago. Isabella Moretti, 19 years old, a ballet student, found dead in her studio apartment. Ruled a suicide, overdose. But the crime scene photos told a different story. Isabella wasn't slumped over or curled up in pain. She was lying on her bed, arms gracefully arched over her head, toes pointed. "Fourth position," Atlas murmured. He scanned the coroner's report. Body discovered by treating psychiatrist Dr. Arthur Pendelton during a home visit. Atlas felt a cold jolt. Pendelton was young then, just starting out. He hadn't perfected the string technique yet. There were no ligature marks on Isabella, but the obsession was there. He had posed her post-mortem. He had tried to turn her death into a final performance. The police saw a beautiful suicide. Atlas saw a director trying to fix a clumsy exit. Atlas grabbed his phone and snapped a picture of the file. He had the link. Now he needed the location. He checked Pendelton's property records, nothing but a townhouse in Chelsea. But a puppeteer needs a workshop, a place to carve, to varnish, to store. He cross-referenced Isabella's file. The ballet school she attended, the Blackwood Academy of Arts. Closed down 10 years ago due to structural instability. Atlas checked the ownership of the abandoned building. It was owned by a shell company, Geppetto Holdings. "Got you," Atlas grinned. But the grin didn't reach his eyes. It was too easy. Pendelton was smart. If Atlas found this, it was because Pendelton wanted him to find it. Atlas's apartment was a sanctuary of controlled chaos. Located in a converted loft in Shoreditch, it was filled with books, strange artifacts, and a massive whiteboard covered in theories. He unlocked the door, exhausted, his mind already racing with plans to raid the Blackwood Academy. He stepped inside and froze. The air was different. The stillness was wrong. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't own one. He stood in the doorway scanning his living room. Everything looked normal. The Persian rug was straight. The books were stacked. But Atlas Vance noticed what others didn't. He walked to his coffee table. His chessboard was there. He had been playing a game against himself for weeks, a complex variation of the Sicilian defense. He had left the game in mid-play, white to move. Now, the board had changed. The pieces had been moved. The game was over. It was checkmate. Black had won. But it wasn't just the move. The white king, Atlas's piece, was gone. In its place stood a small, crude wooden figure. It was hand-carved, wearing a tiny suit made of fabric scraps. It had messy hair and a miniature scarf. It was a marionette of Atlas. Attached to the puppet's crossbar was a small, cream-colored card. Written in elegant calligraphy, the ink still smelling faintly of cloves. A critic watches from the audience. A true artist joins the stage. Curtain rises at dawn. "Don't be late, Mr. Vance. The Blackwood Academy." Atlas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty window. Pendelton had been here. He had walked through Atlas's defenses, touched his most personal possessions, and left a mockery of him in the center of his home. He hadn't stolen anything. He had stolen Atlas's sense of safety. "He was testing me," Atlas realized, picking up the little puppet. It was carved with terrifying accuracy. Pendelton had memorized Atlas's features during their brief meeting, or he had been watching him for much longer. Atlas turned the puppet over. Carved into the back of the wooden head was a single word: joyless. Atlas's breath hitched. That was the word his father used to call him, a secret he had buried deep in his childhood. How could Pendelton know? The phone in his pocket buzzed. It was Thorne. "Atlas, where are you? We got a hit on the fiber. It's a rare polymer used in antique restoration. We're getting a warrant for Pendelton's house." "Don't go to his house, Sarah," Atlas said, his voice void of emotion. He was staring at the puppet's painted eyes. "Why?" "We have probable cause." "Because he's not there. He's waiting for me." "Waiting where?" "Atlas, don't do anything stupid. Tell me where you are." Atlas looked at the card again. Curtain rises at dawn. It was 4:30 a.m. He had an hour. "I'm at home, Sarah. I'm just thinking." "Atlas, I'm sending a car to pick you up. Do not engage him alone. He's dangerous." "I know," Atlas whispered. "That's why I have to go alone. He's written a script, Sarah. If the police show up, he'll burn the theater down with himself inside, and we'll never know why. He wants a dialogue." "This isn't a debate club. It's a murder investigation." "Trust me," Atlas said, and hung up. He put the phone on the table. He wouldn't take it. Pendelton would expect a wire or a tracker. He had to go in naked, stripped of technology, armed only with his mind. He picked up the puppet one last time. He snapped the strings, severing the wooden figure from its control bar. He put the broken Atlas doll in his pocket. "No strings," he muttered to the empty room. He grabbed his coat and walked out into the night. He wasn't going as a detective. He was going as the final act. The main hall of the Blackwood Academy was a cavern of shadows. Dust motes danced in the single, harsh spotlight that illuminated the center of the rotting stage. And there he stood. Dr. Arthur Pendelton was no longer wearing his expensive wool coat. He was dressed in a black apron stained with varnish and oils. In his hands he held a long, thin wire, a garrote made of the same synthetic fiber used on Evelyn Sterling. "You're late," Pendelton's voice echoed from the stage, amplified by the perfect acoustics of the theater. "The audience hates to wait." Atlas walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. He didn't run. He walked with hands in his pockets, casual, as if he were looking for a seat at the cinema. "Traffic was murder," Atlas replied, stopping at the edge of the stage. He looked up at Pendelton. Behind the doctor, hanging from the rafters, were dozens of wooden limbs, unfinished puppets, faces without eyes, a silent choir of the incomplete. "Do you like my workshop?" Pendelton asked, gesturing with the wire. "It's where I fix things. People are so broken, Atlas. They flail, they scream, they make mistakes. But here they are graceful, perfect." "Is that what you did to Isabella?" Atlas asked, climbing the stairs onto the stage. "Did you fix her?" Pendelton's face twitched. "Isabella was a draft, a sketch. But Evelyn was art. And you will be my magnum opus." Pendelton stepped forward. He was bigger than Atlas, stronger. The madness in his eyes wasn't frantic. It was cold and absolute. "Why me?" Atlas asked, standing his ground. "Because you see the strings," Pendelton whispered, now only a few feet away. "Every other critic is blind. But you understand the mechanics. To turn a man who sees everything into a doll that sees nothing, that is the ultimate challenge." Pendelton lunged. He was fast. He wrapped the wire around Atlas's neck before Atlas could dodge. The wire bit into the skin. Atlas gasped, stumbling back, but Pendelton tightened his grip, pulling Atlas upright, forcing him into a grotesque posture. "Don't struggle," Pendelton hissed in his ear. "It ruins the pose." Atlas's vision blurred. The lack of oxygen was setting in. He could feel Pendelton's breath on his neck, the smell of turpentine overwhelming him. He had seconds. He didn't fight the wire. He didn't claw at his neck. Atlas reached into his pocket and pulled out the broken wooden puppet, the one Pendelton had left in his apartment. "She hated you," Atlas choked out. Pendelton froze. The wire loosened just a fraction. "What?" Atlas gasped for air, his voice raspy but steady. "Your mother. She hated you." "Shut up!" Pendelton tightened the grip again. "She called you joyless." Atlas wheezed, holding up the broken puppet so Pendelton could see the word carved on the back. "You didn't carve this word because you know my secrets, Arthur. You carved it because it's the name she gave you. You aren't a god. You're just a little boy trying to make mommy smile by playing with dolls." Pendelton's hands shook. The wire went slack. He stared at the word joyless on the wooden head. "You're lying," Pendelton whispered. The cold facade was cracking. "Look at your art," Atlas continued, stepping away from the wire, massaging his throat. He gestured to the hanging limbs. "It's not genius. It's derivative. It's boring. I checked your reviews, Arthur. The critics didn't understand you, not because you were too deep, but because you were empty." "I am an artist!" Pendelton screamed. The sound was raw, animalistic. "No," Atlas said, his voice dripping with pity. "You're a mechanic. You don't create life. You just arrange death. And the saddest part? Evelyn wasn't looking at the doll because she was scared. She was looking away from you because you were boring her." It was the final strike, the narcissist's greatest fear, irrelevance. Pendelton dropped the wire. He clutched his head, his eyes darting around the theater as if the invisible audience was laughing at him. The composure, the elegance, the Hannibal Lecter persona shattered. What remained was a shivering, pathetic man. "Stop it!" Pendelton shrieked. "Stop the laughter!" "There is no laughter, Arthur," Atlas said softly, stepping closer. "Just silence, because the show has been canceled." For a moment, Pendelton looked broken. He looked like he might surrender, but then the eyes snapped, the pupil dilated. The artist died, and the killer survived. "No!" Pendelton snarled, his lips curling back to reveal teeth. "If I can't have an audience, I'll burn the theater." He grabbed a rusted chisel from the workbench and lunged at Atlas, aiming for his heart. This wasn't a calculated move. It was pure, chaotic rage. Atlas had no time to dodge. He braced for impact. Bang! The doors of the theater burst open. A blinding light flooded the stage. Bang! A single gunshot echoed. The chisel flew out of Pendelton's hand as a bullet struck his shoulder. He spun around and collapsed onto the dusty floorboards, screaming not in pain, but in fury. "Police! Armed police! Stay down!" D.I. Sarah Thorne ran down the aisle, her weapon drawn, followed by a tactical team. Atlas stood over the fallen killer. He didn't look relieved. He adjusted his collar, hiding the red line around his neck. Thorne vaulted onto the stage, kicking the chisel away and cuffing Pendelton, who was now sobbing into the floor. "You okay?" Thorne asked, breathless, looking at Atlas's neck. "You look like hell." Atlas looked down at Pendelton, then at the empty theater seats. "I'm fine, Sarah," Atlas said, dusting off his coat. "Just a harsh review from a critic." He walked to the edge of the stage and looked out into the darkness one last time. "But you were right about one thing," Atlas whispered to the empty room. "The show is over." He turned his back on the stage, on the puppets, and on the man who wanted to be God, and walked out into the London dawn.